Start. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Siam Society members and guests. On behalf of the Siam Society, I'm especially delighted to welcome you this evening in person, and not virtually, to a lecture entitled Land, Ladies, and the Law, a case study on women's land rights and welfare in Southeast Asia in the 19th century. While I believe many of you, as I, have attended various lectures on different aspects of Siam in the 19th century, focusing on subjects such as monarchy, colonialism, and trade, the topic of cultural land ownership, especially by women, is completely new to me and intriguing. Even today, land ownership in Thailand is complicated due to the various types and stages of land title ownership deeds. As it was only in 1872 that King Chulalongkorn introduced procedures to recognize land rights, the 19th century certainly must have presented its own special challenges concerning property ownership. Thus, I look forward to learning more about land rights in the 19th century, the legal issues and court cases involved, and the economic implications associated with who controlled agricultural land. The fact that women played such an important role as agrarian landowners during the 19th century comes as a surprise to me. I am eager this evening to be enlightened about the role of women during this period and learn more about how our speaker was able to come to this conclusion through her painstaking research conducted with Professor Chankrajang. Thus, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, Professor Jessica Vechbanyongratana. Dr. Jessica holds a bachelor's degree in Asian Studies from Whitman College in Washington State, USA, and a master's and PhD in economics from the University of Colorado. She is currently an assistant professor at the Faculty of Economics, Chulalongkorn University. Her research interests and work involve the 19th century and 20th century economic history of Thailand. Her papers and research on these topics have been published in various economic journals, and her joint work with Dr. Thanyaporn on Thai economic history has received awards from the National Research Council of Thailand and the Social Science Association of Thailand. So, thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Kun Jane, and thank you for the invitation from the Siam Society to come and speak this evening. This has been postponed a few times, so I'm very happy to be able to do this in person and just share, for me, actually, one of my most favorite projects I've worked on during my professional career. So this is Land, Ladies, and the Law. And this is joint work with Ajahn Thanyaporn Chankrajang, who's also in the Faculty of Economics at Chulalongkorn University. And in an attempt to be young and hip, I have a little meme here. So how it started, I worked on the history, a brief economic history of land rights in Thailand. We have a short book that we published in 2017. And as we were writing this brought up some questions, particularly on women's land rights. And so how it's going is that this particular article was just published last year in 2021 in the Economic History Review. And so this is one of sort of several different papers we've been working on, and I've been working on individually as well, on various aspects of land rights in Thailand during the 19th and early 20th centuries. So why are we even interested in women's land entitlement? This is something I get asked. It's like, who cares? Why do we care about women's land entitlement? Well, we care because land, of course, represents wealth and also a productive asset when we're talking about highly agricultural economies. And access to secure land rights would then have important productivity and welfare implications for households in these agricultural economies. But throughout history and currently as well, there's a lot of current research talking about the fact that it does matter who within the household has access to those land rights. So even though a household might have a farm, the married couple within the household, one person might have more rights over that land and the production and the decision-making on that land than the other person. In economic research, we do find that women who have clearly defined and enforced rights over assets, including things like land, have higher bargaining power within the household, which means greater decision-making power. And we also know that women are often tasked with domestic welfare. And so if they have access over resources, this can actually translate into higher welfare for households. This is why we see in like economic development programs, such as like cash transfer programs, often those cash transfers go to women and not to the men in the household. And the reason why is because women are much more likely to spend on household welfare. So that's why we're interested in this. So there's this question, are traditional land rights in Siam secure? And we know that in 1901, King Chulalongkorn adopted a Western land code. It's called the Torrens System of Land Administration, with registration that's based on cadastral survey. And many believe that prior to 1901, land rights were generally insecure, and it was kind of a mess. So it's like there's kind of ad hoc systems of kind of keeping track of who owns what. But in our earlier work, in the book that we published in 2017, Ajahn Thanyaporn and I find that land rights were actually generally fairly secure during the 19th century in terms of breadth and duration, even before the introduction of the Torrens system. So what we're doing in this paper, so we said generally there's secure land rights, but we want to know specifically, do women have those same rights? So do women and men, are they kind of on the same footing in terms of those land rights? Okay, so do those general findings apply to female landholders in the 19th century? And we're going to be looking at two different dimensions, the de jure and the de facto dimensions of land ownership. So in order to evaluate this, we're going to look to see whether there's formal documentation guaranteeing women's rights to land, and then also looking for evidence to see whether women were felt secure enough in their rights to make long-term land investments. We also know that towards the end, or actually the second half of the 19th century, our data comes from the end of the 19th century, Siam was exposed to globalization through rice trade, and this actually pushed land values up quite a lot during the second half of the 19th century. And so we want to know, were women actually protected by the legal system with those traditional land rights? Or were they kind of stomped on by sort of the rich and the powerful? So we wanted to know this. And then finally, what are the implications of land rights security on women's and household welfare? Okay, so it's kind of a long laundry list of things that we look at. So what we show in this paper is first the existence of and women's access to de jure rights under Siam's traditional land rights system, evidence in support of women's de facto land rights, evidence of women's de jure rights being upheld in the courts, and then finally we show the welfare implications of these land rights. Okay, first thing, existence of de jure land rights. So these are the rights that are written into law. The traditional land rights system had deeds for everything, and Jane actually mentioned that land ownership in Thailand today is quite complicated because there's different types of rights and different types of deeds, and this actually goes back into the 19th century as well. You had a different type of land deed for paddy fields as you did for orchards, for example, or for garden products. So there's different types of deeds for those different things. But one thing that we found is that these rights were highly recognized by the state, and we conclude that because of the existence of a large amount of government-issued land deeds during the 19th century, and then also annual enforced taxation based on the taxes that are recorded on these deeds. So these deeds were actually serve two purposes. They serve the purpose of kind of saying that this plot belongs to somebody, or at least this person has the right to this plot. Okay, these were usufruct rights, meaning that people were granted the right by the government to farm these lands, and then to reap the benefits of the produce, okay? And it also had information on taxation. So this was a tax document as well. And of course, if you're the government and you're trying to collect taxes, you're going to keep good records on taxes. And so these records we found were actually very systematic, and there's a lot of them. So we found this at the Department of Lands Museum here in Bangkok. And just a little brief side note here. I was kind of looking for a project. When I first moved here and first started at Jure, I decided to kind of shift my focus from American economic history to Thai economic history. And initially people just said, there's no data. There's no way you're going to be able to do anything because there's no data. So I kind of started looking around, and I decided to start visiting museums. And one of the first ones that I visited was the Department of Lands Museum. And I walked in, and there's just, glass cases full of documents. And as an economic historian, I get really excited about that. It's like, whoo, it's like paper with numbers. This is fantastic. And so there was a lot of things, but of course it's just one-off things. There's like, example of a deed here, example of a sales contract here. But there was a couple of cabinets, and I asked the curator, I was like, what's inside those cabinets? And he's like, I don't know. They've been closed, they've been locked since we opened the museum 25 years ago. And I had an RA who was working with me, and she kind of kept asking. And eventually he was like, he found the key. It's like, I don't know where the key was, but he found the key and he opened it. And it turns out that there were 2,500 of this particular document. So these are what we call a black book orchard deed. And we think this is circa 1850 because of the type of paper. And I think we identified a date on one of the documents. So it was King Rama IV time period. So this is an orchard deed. And you can actually see, actually, do I have a pointer here or no? Oh, there we go. You can actually see that there's the name here, and it says Amdang is the title, which is a title for a woman, okay? And so this is an orchard that's owned by a woman, and then we have all the information about where this is, information about the size of the plot, the taxation. This is accounting the trees. So for orchards, taxes were based on the number of mature trees. So they'd actually go to the property, count the number of trees, and then calculate the taxes. Okay? And then it says down here what they owe. And this one is actually a reservation property. So this is some property that somebody says, I've cleared this, I've started to make it productive, and so I reserve this for my use. And the government says, okay. So that's what this is. What we're going to be using in this study is deeds that look like this. This is from the 1880s. King Chulalongkorn ordered a census of the orchard lands in the early 1880s, and it was completed between about 1884 and 1889. It took a long time because they have to go to every single orchard and actually count up the number of trees, and you can see the accounting of trees is down here. So we have the number of trees, they have the tax rate for each tree, and then they add it all up, add up all the columns, then we have the total tax rate over here. That is then transferred over to this document, and this is like the photocopy of the deed that the government keeps for the records. This half goes to the landowner. I've only seen 2 examples of this, but we saw about 30,000 examples of what's on the left side. So what I'm going to be working with is basically this document here, the Dongkua Chanots one. Okay, so do we have evidence that women held these types of land deeds? And in order to figure that out, we went to these government copies of the land deeds. And so I'm just going to kind of go through and show you what information they have on them. So with the registration number. So this actually shows that this is very systematic in terms of, within the registry, you know exactly which plot number it was. We had information about the sub-district and the province, a number of contiguous plots, something called a kanat. the land measurements in the 4 cardinal directions, which allows us to actually calculate the area in rai. The border properties in the 4 cardinal directions, so it says like whose orchard it's next to, or whether it's bordering a klong or something else. So this one, you can see the word klong there. So this is bordering a transportation canal. This is the total tax assessment and the owners. So we can see kind of who owns this, and we can tell from the titles. We can see like this one says nai and then nu. So this is actually a father and a child own this property jointly. And then the registration date. So that's what I did. Entered 30,000 land deeds into a database. Actually, for this project, we only used Bangkok, which this is the coverage of the Bangkok deeds. You can see that the Grand Palace is about right there. Most of the deeds are actually on the western side of the city. That's partially because that's the older settlement. Also, there's better soil over there for growing orchard crops. Not quite as much on the newer side, on the east side. One of the things that, as I started doing this project on using orchard deeds, you might want to know, why aren't you using paddy deeds? Well, it's because they didn't have 30,000 paddy deeds at the Land Museum. They only had the orchard deeds. Which actually in some ways was kind of lucky, just because of the way that the taxes are counted. So this is the coverage of the deeds, but a lot of people said, how common is orchard cultivation? And I was like, I don't know, because all I have is the deeds themselves, so I don't know what other households are doing. But the 1883 postal census, which some of you may be familiar with, I digitized the entire thing, or with the help, of course, with the RAs, and we were actually able to geocode all the entries in the postal census, and with every household that actually listed an occupation, which is most of them, we're actually able to see what percentage of households are engaged in orchard cultivation. And what we can see is a clear pattern. Sort of the most urban areas, we have less than 25% of households engaged in orchard cultivation. But then we have this kind of ring just right outside the city, where up to 50 to 75% of households are engaged in orchard cultivation, and then a little bit less out here, and that's because this is starting to be more like paddy fields. So this is very common that you have sort of the urban area with a ring of orchard cultivation, and then beyond that is the paddy fields. And I actually spent some time here at the Siam Society Library looking at some of the historical maps, and this matches up with the historical land use maps that we have from the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Okay, so for the land deeds that we have, we had a total of about 9,000 land deeds for Bangkok that belong to people. Some of them belong to government agencies or temples, for example. So we excluded those. And of those, about 9,000, we have mixed gender ownership. Most of these are probably married couples. There's like a nai amdang, so it's probably a married couple, about half. So 56% are mixed gender ownership. What was interesting, though, is 26% is female only. So that includes single females, but also like sisters or mother-daughter or mother, aunts or whatever. And then only 18% is male only. If we look at, whether or not there was a woman listed on the deed, then 82% of all land deeds had at least one female that was listed as an owner. That was compared to men, it was only 74%. So this is one of the first things that we saw. It's like, whoa, wait a second, what's going on here? That orchard ownership was very much so a part of kind of a sort of women's purview during the 19th century here in Bangkok. And then if we look at just single female owners, 17% of all the deeds were owned actually by single females. So, and this is compared to, I was reading something about women's land ownership in England during about the same time period, and people were getting really excited. Like 9% of all properties were actually held by at least one woman, and I was thinking, "Ooh, that's so different from the picture here in Southeast Asia during the same time period, where it is extremely common. In fact, it is the norm for women to own land. Okay. So we've established that definitely women have the de jure rights, but we also know from a lot of research in economics that de jure rights don't necessarily mean de facto rights. And tenure security may be in question. De facto rights really depend kind of on the community, and that the people in the community actually recognize the rights of others in the community. Okay, so the question is, how do we assess de facto rights? Because we can't go back and sort of ask people, do you feel secure in your land rights? So we have to kind of back this out. So the way that we do this is we look at long-term land investments, because if you are willing to make a long-term investment, it does mean that you feel like your rights are actually secure. And what was really lucky for us is that we're looking at orchards. And when you're planting an orchard, you're not going to reap the benefits of the orchard usually for at least about 7 years if you're cultivating areca nut, for example. It could be longer, it could be 15 years if you're doing other types of fruit trees. So that's what we're going to look at. So what we're going to do is assess perceived land rights by evaluating the number of trees present on orchard properties in Bangkok during the 1880s, because again, these are the census of the trees happened in the 1880s. Even though these documents were actually in use to 1908, the number of trees was actually static, and it was from the count that they took in the 1880s. So in order to do this, we actually have to do some estimation, because unfortunately we don't have the number of each tree. What we do have, though, is the total tax. And the total tax is related to the number of trees on the property. Okay, so remember, the tax was counted on a per tree basis. Now, of course, each property is going to have a mix of trees, and each tree has a different tax rate. However, we got really lucky again. I had about 200 properties where I did have the accounting of the trees. And what we found was that 89% of the trees that were counted were areca nut, or betel nut, mak trees, okay? And so because of that, we just made an assumption, so a simplifying assumption, that every tree is areca nut, and we know the tax rate for that tree. So we took the total tax, divided it by the tax rate, and that gave us an estimate of the number of trees on the property. And so this is what we got. I'm going to highlight this. There's a lot of numbers here. So if we look at all the properties together, and you'll notice that the number here is slightly lower than before. It's only about 8,000. And that's because some of the properties were reservation properties, and they actually don't have a tax rate related to the trees. So we have to kind of take those out. So we're looking at 8,000 properties that do have a tax assessment. And on average, a property had about 304 trees, which is about 548 trees per hectare. Okay? But we'll notice that women look a bit different. In fact, they have more than the average. So they had on average 314 trees per property, or 594 trees per hectare. So they were definitely more intensively cultivating trees than basically men and mixed gender owners. In fact, the men are lagging behind with only 292 trees per property, which translates to 544 trees per hectare. And actually, it's the mixed gender properties that are the least intensive in terms of the number of trees they're growing on the land. Okay, so another kind of interesting, weird thing we didn't expect, that women seem to be growing trees more intensively, but this might be because they have land that has better soil. So if, for example, land is passed down through the family, but it's going through the matrilineal line, they may be on the old properties, whereas men might have to go and get their own properties that are further out, maybe worse soil and so on. So what we do is we actually control for all of that. So we do some economic magic, and statistical magic. And so we actually take into account several things, including the type of owner, whether the owner was Chinese, for example, or part of the nobility. Nobility tends to cultivate very differently from the general population. The plot size, whether you have access to water, both for transportation and irrigation. And then also, like, whether you are kind of in a village area next to a temple. And we also know which district each plot is in, so we actually control for that as well. And just say, okay, each district has different soil qualities, so we'll just kind of take that variable out. Once we've done that, we still find that on average, women cultivate about 6.7% more intensively than mixed gender households, and about 13.4% more intensively than male-owned properties. So we do find that women are, in fact, cultivating more intensively. They're more productive in orchard cultivation. So there's a lot of there's some debate as to why this is. We didn't really go into exactly why this is. All we're kind of taking out of this is saying that clearly women feel like they have secure land rights because they're putting in very large investments into their land. Okay? Okay. Next, we're getting to the part I think the lawyer is going to be interested in, and this is the court cases. So we showed that, okay, women hold the deeds. It seems that their rights are being upheld kind of by the community, but is it being upheld by the courts? And in order to look at this, and let me explain a little bit how we got into this, is because there's a lot of literature on sort of pre-1901 land rights, and it keeps saying that it's insecure, the courts don't matter, they don't pay attention to any types of papers people have, and what we had found up to this point seemed to suggest otherwise. So we're like, well, when we read these other accounts, I don't see any specific evidence from court cases. And also, I know a lot of the claims are made about the Rangsit area, which is very different from Bangkok and other areas. So Rangsit is very, very special because of the way it was developed. Okay, so we decided to go to the National Archives and see if we can find some court cases. And we actually did. It seemed like each ministry sort of had their own judicial system. So the Ministry of Interior took care of course, places that were outside of Bangkok, but then the Ministry of Agriculture also took care of some. And then you had Nakhon Ban in Bangkok. So what we decided is to look at the cases that were specifically for Bangkok because that's the area that we were looking at. Okay? So this is not all of the cases in the National Archives. In fact, this is probably the minority of them. What we did find was 217 total cases before 1901. So we're just looking at the traditional rights. 105 of these 217 cases involved women, and this included, and this is again something that was surprising to us, was 101 commoners and only 4 women that were clearly from the nobility. Okay, so these are regular people, regular Joe Schmoes, or maybe Joanna Schmoes. Okay. Not all of the cases actually had verdicts. A lot of them said, here's all the evidence, and we're going to throw it back to you guys to negotiate a settlement. So there was a lot of those. But we did have 47 out of the 105 cases that involved women that had a clear verdict. So we'll go ahead and take a look at those. In terms of the full sample, the 217, we find that about half, whoops, I guess I didn't highlight this. So about 48% had women that were involved in the cases. And we do see some differences, gender differences in the types of land that are under dispute. So it does seem that women are involved. If you look at the male only versus the female involved here, women seem to be more involved in orchard land disputes. Men tend to be much more involved in paddy disputes. So there may be sort of a gender divide in the type of land that men and women have rights over, but clearly women do have rights over paddy land as well, because we have cases that list women for paddy land. And women also are more likely to have disputes over household land as well, so like land where your house is located. In terms of the temporal distribution of the court cases, most of them are really happening sort of right here at the very end of the 19th century. This kind of lines up with a lot of other documents I've come across. It seems like there's this, the land market is kind of ramping up during this time period. Okay, and in terms of the types of complaints, we kind of picked out sort of the main complaints. There's sometimes multiple complaints, so we kind of picked out the main complaints for each case. So these are like demarcation, border disputes, ownership disputes, land bequests, land sales. So kind of the normal things that you would think of in terms of land disputes. If we're looking at sort of gender differences between them, there's not actually a whole lot. Maybe the ones that we can find is that there seems to be more women involved in ownership disputes, land being used as collateral, as well as land encroachment. But for the most part, there's not huge amounts of gender differences between the types of disputes over land. So just for fun, I want to give you some examples of some of the cases that we looked at. And I always have to thank our RAs who worked on this, because this was on microfilm at the National Archives, and I think we literally made them go blind trying to read these things. And so it was not easy work, and they did an amazing, superb job. So this first case, we have Ms. Im was accused by Mr. Sup and Mr. Lek that her paddy farming encroached the land held by the two men. However, an investigation by the sub-district head showed that Ms. Im held a reservation land deed over the piece of property in question, and hence was found not guilty. So what we say here is that this illustrates that a single female that's holding a government-issued land deed, it was respected in the legal process, and that these deeds could be used as proof of ownership. So again, there's arguments that, yes, there were some deeds, there were some papers that were given out by the government in the 19th century, but they don't really matter. But what we're showing here is that they do, and that they were recognized in courts as ownership documents, not just as tax documents. Okay? In a second case, we have a case that involves a nobleman with a mid-range official government rank, and he sues Ms. Jeed for constructing a new building that obstructed a road that the nobleman used to access his house, causing him immense trouble. After an investigation, the Ministry of Urban Affairs found that to compensate for the obstructed road, Ms. Jeed had built a new, wider road for the community use. The new road was also equipped with better lighting and security guards. More importantly, both the old and the new roads were built on Ms. Jeed's property. They, as a result, were her private property and not public as claimed by the nobleman. So what we say about this is that even though in this case the female counterpart was a defendant against a plaintiff nobleman, her de jure rights over her property was well respected by the ministry, and they were careful to send out an official to kind of get the actual story. Okay, last example here. We have a nobleman with a high official government rank put his house up as collateral for a loan given by Ms. Lam's father. The nobleman later could not repay the loan and thus lost his house. Nevertheless, he refused to leave the property, and Ms. Lam, on behalf of her father, filed a case against the nobleman and won. The nobleman had to leave his property within a month after the verdict was reached. So what was interesting about this case is that we actually have the father in this case entrusting this case to his daughter. And so women must have standing in the legal system to be able to entrust this important type of legal case to her care, and she clearly won in this case. In terms of the verdicts, we wondered if women were less likely to win cases, and we actually find maybe it's maybe the opposite of that. In general, if the plaintiff brings the case to court, we have 72% of the plaintiffs that bring to court win the case, and about 28% of the defendants, of the cases, 28% are defendants that win. Okay. When we look at women when they are, so these are like female-owned properties, kind of 50-50 whether they win or not. But interestingly, the defendants win most of the time in this case. Okay, and then we have when individual women, and we don't have that many individual women that were coming up with cases, but they do, in this case, win most of the time. So when they bring a case to the court, they're very likely to win it. Okay, so we don't see any, again, evidence that women were at a disadvantage when it came to upholding their rights in court. Okay, so in this section, we just show that commoner women had access to the judicial system to uphold their land rights, and women were not more likely to lose than men, and single women who brought cases to court were actually more likely to win than men were. Okay, final thing, I think we're actually more or less on time as well, are the welfare implications. So the whole reason why we're doing this is because, again, in economics we talk a lot about property rights and how that impacts our ability to bargain within our household. So if I have access to assets in the household, it actually puts me in a better bargaining position. And in the case of women, there's lots of research to suggest that they tend to use their positions to for the benefit of the household. So we want to know, how do these rights actually benefit the household? Okay, so we've established that women have both de jure and de facto rights under the traditional land rights system, and that these rights were often upheld in court. So what does the preservation of these land rights mean in terms of welfare? And again, part of the reason why we're looking at this is because much of the previous literature alludes to land having really no value, because you can just go and claim your plot of land. It's kind of this homesteading type of situation. You've probably heard that it were land rich and people poor during this time period. So land doesn't have much value. But at the same time, we see households making very large investments in their properties. So it must translate to welfare in some way. So how do we do this? This is a lot of back-of-the-envelope types of calculations. So this is a sort of a mental exercise to think about how this could actually translate into welfare. So what we try to do is we actually try to estimate the annual profits on these orchard lands. And so the profits are going to equal to the revenue from selling the produce. We're going to subtract out the estimated input costs, and then also we know the tax rate, so we're going to subtract that out. We have to make a lot of assumptions to do this. So the first thing we do is we convert the total tax into the number of trees, as I mentioned earlier, and we assume that every tree on the property is the areca nut tree, with a tax rate of 0.02 baht per tree. We also have, we're very lucky, there's an 1891 publication that came out suggesting, it's kind of like, hey, you want to get into agriculture? Here, this is how you get into it, and this is how much you can expect to earn. And so this was kind of like this book that was a gift from heaven for our particular project. And it says that for areca nut, you could expect to earn 1 baht per year per tree. So we use that as the very rough estimate as the annual revenue per tree. And then we also, based on some historical accounts as well as some contemporary estimates of areca nut cultivation, we estimate that the cost of cultivation is 30% of revenues. And then again, the annual tax is assumed to be 0.02 baht per tree. Okay. We also try to figure out how much does it cost to keep somebody from starving. So basically, what is the cost of a basket of goods that you need to survive in Siam in the 1890s or 1880s? And so we call this the bare bones consumption basket. And this is a technique that's used by a lot of economic historians, partially to be able to make comparisons across different countries at different time periods to see what the welfare of the people is. And so the estimates we have here, these are kind of compiled from different sources. You can, if you're really interested, you can read the appendix of our paper. But the important part is that we estimate that it costs about 12.89 baht per year to basically keep somebody at the subsistence level, including eating 171 kilograms of rice, some sort of legumes, pork, oil, etc. Okay, so we can debate all day and all night about whether these are realistic assumptions, but this is based on others' previous work. Okay, so we estimate that it costs almost 13 baht per year to keep somebody alive, and we pull prices from various different sources, mostly from commercial reports as well as the Siam directories that were published in the 1890s. When we go through and actually estimate the number of trees per property, the distribution looks like this, and we're actually going to be kind of concentrating on the median here. So this is the properties right in the middle number of trees. And you can see that women actually, again, at the median, are producing about 188 trees on their properties, which is more than the men, which is 160, and a little bit more than mixed couples at 179. Okay? So with this number of trees, then we're able to calculate the revenues, calculate the cost of production, and then also the tax rate, and that's how we get our profit estimates, and that's what we have here. Okay, so again, I'm just going to concentrate on the median. So our median household, the profits that the all-female household can hypothetically earn is about 128 baht per year. And this, again, is just on the produce. We're not looking at other types of production that are going on. This is just based on the areca nuts, okay? For men, that's about 109 baht. And then for mixed gender households, it's about 122 baht per year, okay? Now, if we take our bare bones basket and we ask how many adults can that support in our household, and what we find is the median household for women, it can support almost 10 individuals, which is a lot. So for men, it's just slightly less at 8.45, and then for mixed gender households, it's 9.43. Average household size, we don't have good numbers back then, but the best guess is probably around 5 or 6. So these households are really not subsistent households. Okay, this is, and I've written about this in other areas as well, this is probably why we don't see people flocking into the city looking for jobs, and why we use a lot of Chinese migration to fill in a lot of labor positions in the late 19th century and early 20th century, because these orchards are actually fairly lucrative. They're not subsistent. Okay. Okay. Oh, I did highlight that. Okay. Okay, so the final thing is, how does this compare to other countries? And so we use something called the welfare ratio. And we had to do a little bit more hand waving. Again, you can if you're really interested, you can go to the paper and read the appendix and figure out how we did this. But we had to actually come up with, if you are basically laboring on this property, then how much of that profit would actually belong to your own labor. And we come up with this number here. It's about 32 baht per year. So as a laborer on your own property, you produce about 32 baht per year. Okay. In terms of the bare bones basket to support a family of 4, so this would be 2 adults and 2 children, where the 2 children count as 1 adult. So we're trying to actually do this for 3 adults. It's going to cost about 38.67 baht. So that's that 12.89 that I had before times 3. Okay. So for women, for a single female laborer on her own property, she generates about 32 baht, and that almost covers an entire family. Not quite, but almost covers an entire family. So the thing is that we want to compare the welfare of the household here, the orchard household here, to households in other countries. So we've got London, Milan, Beijing, and Japan. And but you have to understand what the assumption is here. The assumption is that if you had a family of 4 and you had a male laborer who goes and works as a carpenter in the city, then how much can he earn and can he support his family? And in London, a carpenter during this time period can support the family. In fact, they could do it kind of 7-fold. Okay? So they earn kind of 7 times as much as they need to support their family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children. In Milan, it's a 1.6, so that carpenter can support basically their family plus a little bit more. In Beijing, it's 1.75, and then in Japan, it's actually fairly low, it's 0.92, and part of that is because of the time period we're looking at. Okay, so our welfare ratio for Siam doesn't look very good. It's 0.83, 0.7, 0.79. But we also argue that this doesn't quite work because we're talking about agricultural households. It's not just one person in that household doing the work. So if we're thinking about a family of 4, we would assume that the adults would probably be working, actually the children probably working on the land as well. So we actually assume that there's 2 adults that are working on these orchards and how much they can earn. And when we calculate it that way, we get what we call these adjusted welfare ratios. And this is much more in line with, let's say, Beijing and Milan. And it is likely that the household welfare in Siam was actually a bit higher than it was in Japan at this time. Okay, so lots of numbers, lots of things to think about. But the point is that with just like 1 or 2 adults working the land, they could actually earn enough to support a family of 4. Okay, so the main conclusions are that women in the 19th century Siam, they did have secure land rights, both in the de jure and the de facto sense. Women could, in fact, use the judicial system to uphold their rights to land in Bangkok, and that these secure land rights and access to legal recourse appear to have had large positive welfare implications for female landowners at the end of the 19th century, and that's where I'm going to leave it. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. There were a lot of statistics, but it was actually extremely fascinating and interesting, and I truly admire the work that you and the team of students and professors that helped you to do the research, because that is a lot of work in, as you say, these records that were written in probably half, you probably couldn't even read half of what you were trying to read. I will start. We're going to have, hopefully other people would like questions, but I have one question to ask first. And my question is, have you ever looked into any records in temples of donations or anything? The only reason I ask that is because I remember I went to a lecture one time where they talked about the funeral books. And the funeral books, it was surprising that women in the funeral books had played very important roles, but of course the funeral books might have been a bit later. But I was just curious whether there was ever any research to maybe records of women donating to temples or anything like that. So that's my question.
That is a great question. No, I have not. I can say that within the land deed records, we do have evidence of transfers to temples. And it doesn't necessarily say whether these are land donations or not, or whether they're land sales. There's one case that I had was really interesting that, this is a bit of a side note, but fun little story. There was somebody who came, and it was Chinese. You can tell that an owner is Chinese because they actually use the word Jin before the name. So he had given mortgage loans to a bunch of houses that were next to each other along the river, and of course everybody defaulted on the loans, and so then he went and kind of collected all of his land deeds, but there was like a space, I think, between a couple of his deeds, and there was a temple in between. And so what he did, or his temple land, not the temple itself, but there was like because the temples themselves would have orchards and I'm not quite sure how that worked into this, if it was supporting the temple or exactly what it was. But there's this wonderful series of records that shows that the temple actually swapped properties with him. So, so that he would have like this contiguous properties along, just right on the riverfront on the Chao Phraya River. So there definitely was quite a few temple deeds in this particular data set, and something I haven't looked at very clearly, but yeah.
Would anyone else like to ask a question? Yes, Dipti?
I just want to say thank you. It's a very interesting talk, like Jane said, and fascinating to get an insight into the legal cases especially. Just want to ask a kind of basic question. I thought all the land belonged to the king.
Good question.
How did it come about that people could own land?
Yeah, so these rights before 1901, I guess you could say technically all belonged to the king, and people petitioned for rights to use that land. So these were called usufruct rights. Basically, they were land use rights. But they were secure. So a lot of people think, well, then it was insecure because it technically was owned by the king. But what we see is that we don't see a lot of like expropriation of land in the documents. We see that people own these land for many years. So the data set covers about 30 years, and people have this land for 30 years straight, and there's not, and the government's not knocking on people's doors and taking it back. Now there are cases of eminent domain. I know there's two cases in particular. One was, and I can't remember which station it is, but as the railway was being built, they actually, the government took over properties to build the station. I don't know much about that. I can see it in the records that it gets transferred to basically the railway department, and it is clear that it's a railway station. There's another case of eminent domain, and I actually wrote a thread about this on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter, you can kind of go back my profile and take a look at it. But the prison, what's the name of it? the main prison, yes, Bangkok prison. All of that property is actually in this data set. So not this particular one, because it was outside of Bangkok, but I just finished, after about 10 years, I finally finished all of the data entry, including in Nonthaburi, and I actually found all the deeds that the government took over, and it says on the deed that it's been taken over and given to the Department of Corrections, and I was able to kind of focus on where that was in the, like on the map. And I was like, oh, that's a major prison. So it's kind of interesting to kind of stumble upon these interesting little stories. So, and that was compensated. So it is eminent domain and not actually expropriation.
So these rights could be passed on from generation to generation,
yes,
and bought and sold?
Yes, and so the one difference with the kind of the full property right, which was introduced in 1901. And these deeds, from what I can tell from this historical record, were kind of transferred from this usufruct right to full private property rights after 1901. So sort of like people who had clear deeds already, it just sort of got transferred to this new type of deed. The one big difference, so you could claim land, you could cultivate it, you can reap the profits from it, you can pass it on to your children, you can sell it, but you couldn't change the land use. So if you had a property that said it was an orchard, if you sold it, the person who bought it had to use it as an orchard. When you have the full private property right, when you sell it to somebody else, they could change the land use. But before 1901, you couldn't do that. So if it's an orchard, it's got to remain an orchard. If you try to change it to something else, then the government could come in and say, that's not what we told you could use it for. So, or somebody else could kind of tell on you or tattle on you and say, oh, they're not using it as an orchard. So, and then they can take it over.
I actually have another comment.
Go for it.
So if women had this power, that meant they also had, could you say that they had more independence in the household? Let's say if their husband was lazy, they could leave, or, you know, they held the purse strings. Does it imply that?
Yeah, and this is actually part of what I want to look at in the future. So this is kind of a longer term research project is, I mean, how does that really translate? And we still kind of see the same thing today. Women have always been very active in the economy. So, I mean, I always tell my students, if you look at an old picture of the floating market, so, you know, how we used to, you know, buy and sell things, like who's in the boats? And everybody's like, oh, it's women, right? So the women are the ones that are really engaged in commerce. If you look at work on history, or even like travel accounts or accounts of like previous diplomats and so on, they often state that, it's really interesting. Women are so involved with the economy. And, but there's also the recognition, and I know that Chris Baker and Ajahn Pasuk have talked about this in a couple of places in their work, that men are often absent. They are monks, they are soldiers, they have to do corvée service. Sometimes they're absent up to 6 months per year. So it shouldn't be any surprise to us that women are so involved with cultivation, with marketing products, and just the economy in general. And I think that certainly spills over to today. We have very high labor force participation rates of women. Women have very high education here and are very, very involved within the economy. So this is a continuation of the past, not necessarily a new thing.
But I look forward to seeing how you put that in the numbers.
Is there anyone else that would like to ask a question? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your information. This is like an eye-opening. Actually, I didn't know that women were doing so well back then. You were saying that you study in economics?
Yes.
And how come this is more about women's land rights?
Mm-hmm.
I would like to know if you're interested about women in Thailand?
Yeah, so my areas of expertise, I think a lot of people, when they think of economics, they think about like stock market and, you know, GDP and stuff. I'm more of a labor economist and development and economic history. So I kind of look at those three things together. I'm particularly, sorry about that. There we go. I'm particularly interested in women's welfare, women's historical roles within economies. I just always have been interested in that. A lot of my contemporary work, because I do a lot of work on the labor market, is particularly looking at women as well. So women in STEM, women, you know, returns to education and things like that. So it's a personal interest of mine. I teach a class called Economics of Gender. I teach a seminar for undergrads that has a whole section on this, you know, women's economic roles in the past and the present. And it's kind of eye-opening because people often think that, well, you know, it's people get married, man goes to work, woman stays at home. But it's like, but why? You know, why is it like that? Or is it like that? So has it always been like that? So it just, interesting questions. And,
right.
And it's all economics. I always tell my students, there's economics in everything.
Great. Most of these are inheritance from families?
It's a little hard to tell because we kind of get this snapshot in time. What we can see are transferred properties, and sometimes it does indicate that it is basically being transferred to the children. There's another type of related deed. It's called a replacement. I don't remember the Thai name, but the English translation at the Department of Lands Museum is a replacement garden title deed. And it was basically the paperwork that was used to kind of transfer it from an old owner to a new owner. And on that one, it was actually very clear that, okay, this is being a split between the son and the daughter of the person who died. But most of them are actually sales. So we got a lot of reservation properties. That means that I went and I claimed this land. There's an empty land. I claim it and I clear it. So that's not a bequest or anything. I just claimed the land. But then what happens to it afterwards, a lot of it is sales. So, and we see sales pick up a lot after 1901 when we have a change in the property right.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Do you have any other questions? If not, then we would like to maybe invite the speaker here and on behalf of the Science Society, we thank you very, very much for a very interesting talk and thoughtful